Ryan smirked across the candlelit table and swirled his wine like he was closing a deal instead of dismantling a marriage. You never really understood finance. Amber, he said, lowering his voice as if he were explaining something simple to a child. I've already arranged everything. The Seattle skyline shimmered behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jazz floated lazily through the restaurant. Couples leaned toward each other in soft conversation. It should have been romantic. Then his phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. His jaw tightened. He glanced down. Card declined. A second notification flashed across the screen. Primary checking account temporarily locked due to unusual activity. Another. Brokerage transaction suspended pending review. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. He forced a laugh. Too sharp to be natural. Must be a glitch. But his hand was shaking now. I could see it in the way his wine rippled inside the glass. Across the table, I folded my napkin slowly and watched him read the words he never expected to see. For the first time in 8 years of marriage, Ryan wasn't looking at me with superiority. He was looking at me with fear. The waiter approached with polite professionalism. Sir, I'm sorry, but this card isn't going through. Ryan cleared his throat and pulled out another card. Try this one. The waiter nodded and disappeared. Ryan's phone buzzed again. A brokerage alert this time. Withdrawal request paused. Compliance review initiated. What the hell? He muttered under his breath, tapping furiously at the screen. The waiter returned, voice still calm. I'm afraid this one was declined as well. I watched Ryan's shoulders stiffen. He offered a strained smile. Give us a minute. The waiter stepped away. Ryan leaned closer to me, lowering his voice. This is ridiculous. The bank system must be down. His thumb moved quickly as he opened his banking app. The loading wheel spun for a long second before the message appeared again. Account temporarily restricted pending verification of recent transactions. His confidence, so carefully constructed, began to crack in real time. Rebecca's name flashed across his screen. He flipped the phone face down. It buzzed again. And again. You should answer that, I said quietly. It's work, he snapped. Too quickly. He stood up, nearly knocking his chair back, and walked toward the balcony area to take the call. I watched him through the glass doors. His posture changed as he listened. His free hand ran through his hair. He shook his head sharply. Pacing. I already knew what she was saying. My own phone remained silent on the table. The wind outside whipped at his suit jacket as he spoke urgently into the receiver. I could see the moment the realization settled in. This wasn't a minor glitch. This was systemic. He came back inside, face pale. What did you do? He whispered, sliding into his chair. There it was. Not anger, not accusation. Fear. I didn't do anything, I said evenly. I just made sure irregular transfers were reviewed. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for something, guilt. Perhaps he wouldn't find it. You reported me, he hissed. I protected myself. The jazz music kept playing. Glasses clinked somewhere to our left. No one else in the restaurant knew that a carefully orchestrated future was unraveling at table 12. An hour earlier, Ryan had invited me here to talk about our next chapter. He had sounded almost gracious on the phone. Now his hands were trembling as another notification lit up his screen. Brokerage access restricted. Compliance inquiry initiated. His breathing grew shallow. I studied him the way I would study a client's balance sheet, looking for structural weakness. Ryan was a product manager at a mid-sized tech firm, a man who prided himself on strategy and positioning. In public, he liked to joke that I was brilliant at theory but not practical with money. Tonight, the system was testing how practical he really was. I have to call the bank, he said, standing again. Of course. He walked toward the hallway near the restrooms, speaking in clipped, urgent tones. I picked up my wine glass and took a small sip. The city lights beyond the window reflected in the dark liquid like scattered signals. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, For months, I had watched patterns form, transfers routed through a consulting LLC, funds allocated to an investment account that did not include my name, capital positioned for a startup I had never agreed to finance. Money always leaves footprints, and when those footprints exceed certain thresholds, financial institutions are required to look closer. Ryan returned, eyes wide. They're saying there's a review, something about linked accounts. This is insane. Is it? I asked quietly. He stared at me, trying to recalibrate his understanding of the woman sitting across from him. The waiter approached again, gently asking if we had another form of payment. Ryan opened his wallet and handed over a final card. I watched his reflection in the window as he waited for the machine to process. He had come here planning to tell me our assets were already separated, that he had positioned everything strategically, that I would be fine. He believed I didn't understand finance. The card machine beeped. Declined. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. In that moment, the dinner he had planned as an announcement became something else entirely. It became an audit, and he finally understood that I had been studying him for 3 months. I watched Ryan through the glass as he paced along the balcony, one hand gripping his phone, the other pressed against his forehead like he could physically hold his world together. The night air lifted the edge of his suit jacket. His movements were sharp, defensive. I couldn't hear Rebecca's voice, but I could imagine it, tight, anxious, asking why her account was suddenly under review. For years, he had believed I didn't understand money. What he never understood was that money was my language. My name is Amber. I was 34 that night, and for the past decade I had worked as a business consultant specializing in financial restructuring and risk management. Companies hired me when their numbers didn't make sense, when cash flow looked healthy on the surface but something underneath was rotting, when executives swore everything was fine while liabilities quietly multiplied. I didn't just read spreadsheets. I read patterns. Ryan was 38, confident, ambitious, and charismatic in the way product managers often are. He could sell a roadmap like it was a revolution. He could walk into a room of investors and leave them nodding. And at home, he liked to believe he was the architect of our success. We had been married 8 years. We owned a house outside Seattle with clean lines and wide windows that made everything look bigger than it was. We drove an electric SUV that neighbors admired. Every summer, we posted photos from Napa, vineyards, sunset dinners, curated happiness. On the outside, we were the couple who figured it out. On the inside, Ryan liked to make small jokes about my relationship with money. At dinner parties, he would grin and say, "Amber's brilliant with strategy, but I handle the real investing." People would laugh. I would smile. The first time he said it, I brushed it off. The second time, I noticed the pattern. By the 5th time, I realized it wasn't humor. It was positioning. He slowly took over the narrative of who controlled what. "I'll rebalance the portfolio," he'd say. "I've got the retirement allocations. Trust me, you don't want to worry about this stuff." At first, I didn't push back. Not because I didn't understand, because I chose my battles carefully. I assumed partnership meant shared visibility, even if one person executed the details. That assumption became my blind spot. The first shift didn't happen loudly. It happened in increments. Ryan started attending more weekend product conferences. He came home later from networking events. His phone began living face down on the counter. He would step outside to take calls. When I asked who it was, he would say, "Work." I knew what work looked like. I had spent years dissecting corporate behavior. This wasn't just work. It was concealment. I remember the first time I saw Rebecca's name appear on his phone screen. We were in the kitchen. I was rinsing wine glasses. His phone lit up beside me. "Rebecca Collins." I didn't react. I dried my hands and set the glass down. That night, when he fell asleep, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the fundraiser where we first met her. She was 30, soft-spoken, an elementary school teacher who had just moved to the district. She admired Ryan openly, asked him questions about investing. About building wealth the smart way. He liked being admired. Weeks later, I noticed new transaction descriptors in our joint account. Strategic advisory fee. Consulting allocation. The amounts weren't outrageous individually, but they were consistent. Structured. I didn't confront him. Instead, I did what I always did when something didn't align. I opened my laptop and exported 12 months of statements. I built a spreadsheet. I mapped every transfer. Patterns formed quickly. Funds moved from our joint savings into a small consulting firm I didn't recognize. From there, they were routed into an investment account that did not include my name. The beneficiary name listed in one confirmation email was Rebecca Collins. The amount wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just an affair. This was financial repositioning. He wasn't just emotionally drifting. He was restructuring. I cross-referenced dates. Transfers aligned with his so-called conferences. With evenings, he claimed to be mentoring someone. With weekends, he said were packed with product workshops. Money doesn't lie. People do. One night, while he showered upstairs, I opened the shared laptop we both used. An email notification sat unread. Investment allocation confirmation. My pulse didn't race. It slowed. The language inside the email was clinical. Professional. Long-term growth positioning. Beneficiary designation confirmed. Rebecca Collins. I printed it. Then I placed it back exactly where I found it. When Ryan came downstairs, hair still damp, he kissed my forehead and asked what I wanted to do that weekend. I looked at him and realized something fundamental. He assumed I trusted him completely. He assumed I didn't understand layered transfers. He assumed I wouldn't trace routing paths through shell entities. He assumed I would react emotionally if I ever found out. He was wrong about all of it. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened a new encrypted folder on my personal cloud drive. I labeled it Risk Exposure. Inside it, I saved the spreadsheet, the email confirmation, screenshots of the consulting firm's registration. Public records showed the LLC had been formed only weeks before the first transfer. The registered agent shared a last name with Rebecca. Coincidence doesn't repeat with precision. By the time Ryan returned from the balcony that night at the restaurant, pale and shaken, I had already lived through 3 months of quiet recalibration. He thought dinner was his announcement. For me, it was a deadline. The night I saw Rebecca's name attached to our money was the night I stopped being a wife trying to preserve harmony. I became an analyst reviewing a case. And I never misread a case. The first time I opened the email with Rebecca's name attached to it, I didn't feel jealousy. I felt confirmation. Ryan was upstairs in the shower, steam drifting down the hallway. His phone was on the kitchen counter, but I didn't need it. The shared laptop was enough. The notification had synced automatically. Investment allocation confirmation. The subject line was clean, almost elegant. I clicked it without hesitation. Beneficiary. Rebecca Collins. The number listed beneath it wasn't a spontaneous gift. It wasn't dinner money or a loan to a friend. It was structured capital, allocated through a consulting entity before landing in a managed investment account. The language was professional, strategic, long-term growth projection. I read it twice. Then I opened our joint account statement and matched the timestamp. Joint Savings to Advisory, LLC. LLC to Private Brokerage. Brokerage to Beneficiary Linked Portfolio. 3 steps. Clean. Intentional. The water upstairs shut off. I closed the email and returned the laptop to exactly the angle it had been before. When Ryan walked into the kitchen in a towel, he smiled like nothing in the world had shifted. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Of course," I said. And I meant it. Everything was finally making sense. Rebecca had entered our lives 6 months earlier at a school fundraiser. She was 30, recently relocated, bright in the way people are when they're still impressed by ambition. She listened when Ryan spoke, asked questions about building smart investments, nodded at everything he said as if it were revelation. He liked that. At the fundraiser, she had laughed at one of his product management analogies. I remember thinking she admired him in a way that felt excessive. I didn't realize then that admiration can become leverage. After that night, Ryan began referencing mentorship. He said he was helping someone understand financial literacy. He framed it as generosity. But generosity doesn't usually require LLC formation. 2 weeks after the fundraiser, a new entity appeared in our transaction logs. Cascadia Strategic Advisory. The name sounded polished, generic enough to avoid scrutiny. I searched the Washington State Business Registry the next morning. The LLC had been registered 23 days earlier. Registered agent. Daniel Collins. Same last name. I dug deeper. Public record listed a mailing address that matched Rebecca's hometown. The formation date aligned exactly with the first transfer out of our joint account labeled Strategic Advisory Fee. That wasn't mentorship. That was structuring. Ryan started traveling more after that. Product conferences. Investor roundtables. Weekends that conveniently overlapped with school holidays. I cross-referenced transfer dates with his travel receipts. Perfect alignment. Every time he claimed to be at a conference, a transfer followed within 48 hours. The consulting LLC received funds first. Then the brokerage account tied to Rebecca received capital allocation. I didn't confront him. Confrontation gives people time to adapt. Instead, I created a secondary spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, routing path. Column D, external activity, travel. Calendar entries, phone logs. Patterns don't lie when you isolate variables. One evening, while he cooked dinner, his phone lit up on the counter. Rebecca. The message preview was brief. Did it go through? He turned the screen face down so quickly the motion itself felt incriminating. Who's that? I asked casually. Work, he said without looking at me. I nodded. That night, I opened our investment dashboard after he fell asleep. A new sub-account had been created under his login credentials. It wasn't joint. It wasn't disclosed. It was positioned as private capital for future venture development. The description line read, Founding Capital Allocation. I leaned back in my chair. He wasn't just transferring money to Rebecca. He was building something. A startup pitch deck sat in his documents folder. I opened it. Concept summary. Market positioning. Projected valuation. Slide 8 caught my attention. Seed capital secured. The number listed matched the total of the diverted funds almost exactly. He was using marital assets as pre-separation startup capital. If incorporated before divorce filing, he could argue it was independent growth. It was clever. Almost impressive. Almost. I scrolled further. Projected equity distribution. Founder majority stake. No co-founder listed. No spouse disclosure. I closed the document and stared at the darkened screen. This wasn't an impulsive affair fueled by emotion. This was a financial exit strategy. I remembered every dinner party joke about me not being practical with money. Every time he told friends I handled theory while he handled reality. Reality was right here. Routed through a shell. Parked under another woman's name. Packaged as entrepreneurial ambition, I printed the LLC registration documents the next morning at a coffee shop downtown. I didn't want any traceable printing logs at home. When I returned, Ryan was in the living room drafting emails. Big things coming, he said, smiling. I'm sure, I replied. He wasn't reckless. That was the part that almost hurt more. He believed complexity would shield him. He believed I wouldn't recognize layered routing or beneficiary structuring. He believed admiration from Rebecca validated his decisions. He believed silence from me meant ignorance. By the end of that week, I had mapped every transfer. I stored copies in a secure cloud account under two-factor authentication he couldn't access. The final piece came when I noticed a draft email he hadn't sent yet. Subject: timing the announcement. The body referenced finalizing capital positioning before formal discussion. Formal discussion. Divorce. He was planning to tell me once everything was secured beyond my reach. I stood in the hallway that night and looked at our wedding photo on the wall. We had once built spreadsheets together at our tiny kitchen table, compared savings goals, talked about future equity like it was shared oxygen. Somewhere along the way, partnership turned into positioning. He thought he was building an exit. What he didn't realize was that every move he made left a trail, and I was already following it. The first time I opened the email with Rebecca's name attached to it, I didn't feel jealousy. I felt confirmation. Ryan was upstairs in the shower, steam drifting down the hallway. His phone was on the kitchen counter, but I didn't need it. The shared laptop was enough. The notification had synced automatically. Investment allocation confirmation. The subject line was clean, almost elegant. I clicked it without hesitation. Beneficiary. Rebecca Collins. The number listed beneath it wasn't a spontaneous gift. It wasn't dinner money or a loan to a friend. It was structured capital, allocated through a consulting entity before landing in a managed investment account. The language was professional, strategic, long-term growth projection. I read it twice. Then I opened our joint account statement and matched the timestamp. Joint Savings to Advisory LLC. LLC to Private Brokerage. Brokerage to Beneficiary Linked Portfolio. 3 steps. Clean. Intentional. The water upstairs shut off. I closed the email and returned the laptop to exactly the angle it had been before. When Ryan walked into the kitchen in a towel, he smiled like nothing in the world had shifted. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Of course," I said. And I meant it. Everything was finally making sense. Rebecca had entered our lives 6 months earlier at a school fundraiser. She was 30, recently relocated, bright in the way people are when they're still impressed by ambition. She listened when Ryan spoke, asked questions about building smart investments, nodded at everything he said as if it were revelation. He liked that. At the fundraiser, she had laughed at one of his product management analogies. I remember thinking she admired him in a way that felt excessive. I didn't realize then that admiration can become leverage. After that night, Ryan began referencing mentorship. He said he was helping someone understand financial literacy. He framed it as generosity. But generosity doesn't usually require LLC formation. 2 weeks after the fundraiser, a new entity appeared in our transaction logs. Cascadia Strategic Advisory. The name sounded polished, generic enough to avoid scrutiny. I searched the Washington State Business Registry the next morning. The LLC had been registered 23 days earlier. Registered agent. Daniel Collins. Same last name. I dug deeper. Public record listed a mailing address that matched Rebecca's hometown. The formation date aligned exactly with the first transfer out of our joint account labeled Strategic Advisory Fee. That wasn't mentorship. That was structuring. Ryan started traveling more after that. Product conferences. Investor roundtables. Weekends that conveniently overlapped with school holidays. I cross-referenced transfer dates with his travel receipts. Perfect alignment. Every time he claimed to be at a conference, a transfer followed within 48 hours. The consulting LLC received funds first. Then the brokerage account tied to Rebecca received capital allocation. I didn't confront him. Confrontation gives people time to adapt. Instead, I created a secondary spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, routing path. Column D, external activity travel. Calendar entries. Phone logs. Patterns don't lie when you isolate variables. One evening, while he cooked dinner, his phone lit up on the counter. Rebecca. The message preview was brief. Did it go through? He turned the screen face down so quickly the motion itself felt incriminating. "Who's that?" I asked casually. "Work," he said without looking at me. I nodded. That night, I opened our investment dashboard after he fell asleep. A new sub-account had been created under his login credentials. It wasn't joint. It wasn't disclosed. It was positioned as private capital for future venture development. The description line read, "Founding capital allocation." I leaned back in my chair. He wasn't just transferring money to Rebecca. He was building something. A startup pitch deck sat in his documents folder. I opened it. Concept summary. Market positioning. Projected valuation. Slide 8 caught my attention. Seed capital secured. The number listed matched the total of the diverted funds almost exactly. He was using marital assets as pre-separation startup capital. If incorporated before divorce filing, he could argue it was independent growth. It was clever. Almost impressive. Almost. I scrolled further. Projected equity distribution. Founder majority stake. No co-founder listed. No spouse disclosure. I closed the document and stared at the darkened screen. This wasn't an impulsive affair fueled by emotion. This was a financial exit strategy. I remembered every dinner party joke about me not being practical with money. Every time he told friends I handled theory while he handled reality. Reality was right here. Routed through a shell. Parked under another woman's name. Packaged as entrepreneurial ambition. I printed the LLC registration documents the next morning at a coffee shop downtown. I didn't want any traceable printing logs at home. When I returned, Ryan was in the living room drafting emails. "Big things coming," he said, smiling. "I'm sure," I replied. He wasn't reckless. That was the part that almost hurt more. He believed complexity would shield him. He believed I wouldn't recognize layered routing or beneficiary structuring. He believed admiration from Rebecca validated his decisions. He believed silence from me meant ignorance. By the end of that week, I had mapped every transfer. I stored copies in a secure cloud account under two-factor authentication he couldn't access. The final piece came when I noticed a draft email he hadn't sent yet. Subject: timing the announcement. The body referenced finalizing capital positioning before formal discussion. Formal discussion. Divorce. He was planning to tell me once everything was secured beyond my reach. I stood in the hallway that night and looked at our wedding photo on the wall. We had once built spreadsheets together at our tiny kitchen table. Compared savings goals. Talked about future equity like it was shared oxygen. Somewhere along the way, partnership turned into positioning. He thought he was building an exit. What he didn't realize was that every move he made left a trail. And I was already following it. I treated our joint accounts the way I would treat a distressed company on the verge of collapse. Methodically. Emotion had no place in analysis. The morning after I confirmed the LLC registration, I exported 12 full months of bank statements and uploaded them into my secure workspace. I built a master spreadsheet with conditional formatting to highlight recurring patterns. The first thing I noticed wasn't the size of the transfers. It was the rhythm. Funds moved in consistent intervals, never random, never impulsive. Each transfer from our joint savings account to Cascadia Strategic Advisory was labeled as Strategic Advisory Fee. From there, within 24 to 48 hours, capital flowed into a brokerage account tied to Ryan's login. Then, in staggered increments, allocations appeared under a beneficiary portfolio linked to Rebecca. 3 layers. Just enough complexity to feel insulated, but not enough to withstand forensic review. I searched deeper into Cascadia Strategic Advisory. The company had no website, no listed employees, no active business licenses beyond the registration itself. The mailing address was a residential property 30 minutes outside Seattle. Daniel Collins, registered agent. I ran a simple background search. Rebecca's cousin. Formation date. Exactly 3 weeks before the first major transfer. If this were a client case, I would have called it what it was, asset diversion structured through a shell. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This wasn't reckless spending. It wasn't emotional generosity. It was premeditated financial repositioning. That night, Ryan came home unusually energized. "I've been thinking about launching something of my own," he said, pouring himself a drink. "A product strategy platform. Lean. Disruptive. That sounds ambitious," I replied. "I've already secured some capital." "Of course you have." I thought. He described the concept with enthusiasm. Market gaps. Scalability. Early traction. He talked about equity distribution like he was narrating a future success story. He didn't mention that the capital came from funds he had quietly extracted from our shared reserves. He didn't mention Rebecca. He didn't mention that the pitch deck labeled him sole founder. He assumed I didn't connect dots. I watched him speak and realized something unsettling. He wasn't trying to hide from me emotionally. He was hiding structurally. I opened the pitch deck again later that week and examined the capitalization table more carefully. Projected ownership percentages. Founder majority stake. No spousal claim. No marital disclosure, if he incorporated the startup before filing for divorce. Valuation disputes could become complicated. If early growth could be framed as post-separation development, he could shield future equity from division. It was strategic, but he underestimated the timeline. Washington state marital property law is clear about asset dissipation before separation. Transfers made with intent to reduce a spouse's claim can trigger serious legal consequences. Intent doesn't have to be shouted. It can be inferred from pattern. The transfers increased in size over the next few weeks. He liquidated part of our joint investment holdings under the justification of portfolio rebalancing. The funds were routed through the LLC again before landing in the startup allocation account. Each move tightened the pattern. One evening, I sat at the kitchen island reviewing statements when Ryan walked in. "You double-checking budgets?" he asked lightly. "Just staying organized," I said. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on the spreadsheet longer than usual. He was beginning to sense scrutiny. That didn't concern me. Confrontation before documentation is completed is inefficient. I kept gathering evidence. I downloaded copies of the LLC filing, screenshots of the brokerage allocations, email confirmations with timestamps. I saved everything into encrypted storage separate from any device he could access. Money leaves footprints. The question is whether anyone bothers to look at them. One afternoon, I researched bank compliance protocols for suspicious activity. Not to exploit them. To understand them, financial institutions are legally required to review certain patterns, linked transfers, shell routing, beneficiary mismatches, rapid capital positioning tied to new entities. If thresholds are crossed, temporary restrictions are imposed, pending clarification. Temporary, procedural, not punitive. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in protection. I returned to the prenup we had signed 8 years earlier. At the time, it had felt unnecessary. We were building everything together. The document was just a formality suggested by our attorneys. I retrieved it from the safe in our hallway closet. The paper felt heavier than I remembered. I flipped past standard clauses, division of assets, debt allocation, arbitration procedures. Then I found it. A section on intentional concealment or dissipation of marital assets. If one party knowingly redirected shared funds without disclosure, the other party could petition for immediate review and temporary financial restraint pending investigation. The language wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Threshold amounts were defined. Documentation requirements outlined. Remedies clearly stated. Ryan had skimmed this document years ago. I remembered him saying, "We'll never need this." He was right. We wouldn't have, if he hadn't triggered it. I closed the prenup and placed it back in the safe. That night, he made dinner reservations at a rooftop restaurant downtown. "Let's celebrate," he said. "I've got something important to share." I looked at him and smiled. Of course. He believed he had positioned everything beyond my reach. He believed complexity protected him. He believed I would react emotionally once he announced the divorce. He didn't realize the most dangerous position in any negotiation is assuming the other party hasn't prepared. I had spent weeks mapping every dollar, every routing path, every beneficiary. I wasn't angry anymore. I was aligned. And when alignment meets documentation, outcomes follow. By the time he raised his wine glass at that dinner and told me I didn't understand finance, I had already read the clause that would change his future. Technical details don't need drama. They just need timing. I spread the prenup across the dining table long after Ryan had gone to bed. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows. I ran my fingers over the pages. scanning familiar legal language that once felt irrelevant. We had signed it 8 years earlier, sitting side by side in a downtown office, laughing about how we would never need it. We were wrong. I turned to the section on financial transparency and asset dissipation. The clause wasn't dramatic. It didn't threaten punishment or ruin. It described procedure. If one spouse knowingly concealed or diverted marital assets beyond a specified threshold without disclosure, the other spouse could petition for temporary financial restraint and formal review. The language was precise. Documentation required. Evidence threshold defined. Remedy procedural. It didn't promise revenge. It promised review. I read it 3 times. Ryan had skimmed this section years ago. I remembered him waving his pen and saying, "This is just technical stuff. It'll never apply to us. Technical details are the ones that matter most." The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with a marital financial attorney downtown. I didn't tell Ryan. I told him I had client meetings. The attorney's office overlooked Elliott Bay. Clean lines. Neutral decor. A place designed for clarity. I handed over a folder containing printouts, bank statements, transfer maps, LLC registration records, screenshots of the pitch deck. She didn't react emotionally. She read, "This is structured," she said finally. "Not impulsive?" That single sentence confirmed everything I already knew. We walked through Washington state marital property law carefully. Asset dissipation before separation could trigger corrective redistribution. Intent could be inferred from routing patterns, beneficiary concealment, and timing relative to divorce planning. "What are you seeking?" she asked. "Protection," I said. She nodded. We discussed the startup element next. If Ryan incorporated before a divorce filing and claimed growth as independent capital, valuation could become complicated. But if funding originated from concealed marital assets, that argument weakened significantly. Timing mattered. So did documentation. We reviewed the thresholds defined in the prenup clause. The diverted funds exceeded them. Barely. Strategically. He had moved just enough to build capital but not enough to appear reckless. He believed that line protected him. He forgot the line was written in the document he signed. My attorney explained how temporary financial restraint worked. A petition could be filed requesting review based on documented irregular transfers. Financial institutions, once notified through proper channels, could initiate compliance assessment, not punishment. Procedure. She emphasized something critical. This wasn't sabotage. It was lawful review triggered by documented concern. "Are you prepared for escalation?" she asked. Yes. I drove home that afternoon with a strange calm settling over me. Ryan was in the living room when I walked in. Laptop open. Excitement on his face. "I think I'm close to finalizing the capital structure," he said. "This could really change everything." I smiled. "I'm sure it will." Over the next few days, I compiled every document into chronological order. Bank routing confirmations, email timestamps, business registry filings, transfer amounts. I saved copies to encrypted storage under a separate email address he didn't know existed. I printed physical copies and stored them in a secure folder at my attorney's office. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for documentation. Ryan grew increasingly confident. One night over dinner he said, "I've been thinking about how we handle finances moving forward. We might need to restructure things for tax efficiency." Restructure. The word carried weight now. I nodded, letting him speak. He described capital positioning as if I were a passive listener. He had no idea I had mapped every dollar. My attorney filed the petition quietly 2 weeks later. We attached documentation demonstrating undisclosed transfers, linked beneficiary accounts, and structured routing through a shell entity tied to a personal relationship. We did not accuse. We requested review. There's a difference. The compliance threshold was triggered. Temporary financial restraint pending clarification. The phrase felt clinical and powerful. Ryan had booked dinner reservations for Friday night at a rooftop restaurant downtown. He told me he wanted to celebrate new beginnings. I understood what that meant. He believed his capital was secured. He believed his startup was insulated. He believed he could announce divorce with financial control already established. On Thursday evening, my attorney called. "The review has been formally logged," she said. "If institutions respond within expected timelines, restrictions may appear within 48 hours. 48 hours? I looked at the calendar. Friday night. I thanked her and ended the call. I stood in the hallway and looked at our wedding photo. 2 younger versions of us, smiling without calculation. I didn't feel rage. I felt inevitability. If he had simply spoken to me, if he had disclosed his ambitions, his dissatisfaction, his desire to leave, I might have handled it differently. But concealment changes the equation. He attempted to reposition our shared future without my consent. The system would now reposition his assumptions. On Friday afternoon, I dressed carefully for dinner. Not to impress him, not to intimidate him, to steady myself. He picked me up from the house like it was a date, opened the car door, smiled with practiced confidence. "You're going to be proud of me," he said as we drove toward the city. "I'm sure I will," I replied. He thought that dinner would be his announcement. He didn't know it would be a deadline. And deadlines don't negotiate with ego. Once the petition was filed, there was nothing dramatic left to do. There were no arguments, no slammed doors, no emotional confrontations in the kitchen. There was only waiting. Real leverage builds quietly. For 3 months, I lived beside Ryan as if nothing had changed. I made coffee in the mornings. I asked about his meetings. I listened when he talked about product roadmaps and market strategy. I even nodded when he mentioned capital positioning with a spark in his eyes. Inside, I was tracking timelines. I knew exactly when the first diverted transfer had occurred. I knew how many had followed. I knew the threshold defined in our prenup. I knew the approximate response window for compliance review once documentation was logged. Outwardly, I was calm. Internally, I was aligning variables. Ryan's confidence grew during those months. He believed the complexity of his structure protected him. He believed that layering transfers through Cascadia Strategic Advisory made everything look legitimate. He underestimated how predictable people become when they think they're clever. The transfers increased in size. What began as moderate reallocations turned into larger liquidations labeled as portfolio rebalancing. He shifted funds from our joint investment account, routed them through the LLC, then positioned them as startup capital. I added each transaction to my spreadsheet. Date, amount, routing path, purpose label, associated external activity. I cross-referenced everything. His so-called weekend conferences aligned perfectly with the transfers. Rebecca's school calendar breaks matched the timing of certain capital movements. The pattern tightened like a loop closing in on itself. I didn't confront him. Confrontation gives someone time to restructure. Instead, I double-checked that the petition had been formally processed. My attorney confirmed the documentation exceeded the threshold required for procedural review. Compliance triggers don't activate instantly. They require verification, internal routing, quiet assessment, which meant there was a period where Ryan believed he had won. That period was the most dangerous. One evening, he came home energized. "I think I'm ready," he said, loosening his tie. "Everything's positioned. I've minimized exposure. It's clean." Exposure. The word lingered in the air. Minimized exposure to what? I asked lightly. "Risk," he said. "You always talk about risk. I've handled it." I smiled. He didn't realize I was the one managing it now. Rebecca's involvement became more visible during those weeks. Her name appeared in his call logs more frequently. Calendar entries marked with a single initial, R, started appearing on weekends. Once, I saw him standing in the driveway late at night, phone pressed to his ear. "I told you it's fine," he said in a low voice. "Everything's secured." Secured. He believed that. I returned inside and opened my encrypted folder. Every file was organized. Every document backed up twice. Evidence doesn't require emotion. It requires preservation. My attorney called midway through the 3rd month. The preliminary review phase is nearly complete, she said. If institutions respond as expected, restrictions could appear within 48 to 72 hours of final trigger confirmation. 48 to 72 hours. Ryan made dinner reservations the next day. Let's celebrate, he said casually. I have important news. I knew what that meant. He was going to announce the divorce. He believed his capital was insulated. His startup was funded. His future equity was beyond my reach. He assumed I would be shocked, that I would argue, that I would beg for explanation. Instead, I adjusted my timeline. The day before dinner, I verified that the compliance report had been formally logged and acknowledged. The threshold defined in our prenup had been exceeded clearly. With documentation attached, everything was aligned. That afternoon, Ryan seemed almost relieved. I've been thinking about how we move forward, he said. It'll be cleaner than you expect. Cleaner. I wondered if he realized how ironic that sounded. We drove to dinner as the sun set behind the Seattle skyline. The city lights flickered on one by one. Steady and indifferent. Ryan reached over and squeezed my hand. You'll understand, he said. He believed that, at the restaurant, he ordered wine confidently. He spoke about new chapters and efficient separation. He used words like strategic and optimized. He had rehearsed this. As he talked, I noticed his phone lighting up repeatedly on the table. He ignored it at first. Then it buzzed again. And again. His expression shifted subtly. He glanced down, frowning. I knew the review window had closed. Compliance procedures don't announce themselves dramatically. They activate. By the time he stepped outside to take the first urgent call, I already understood what the next 48 hours would look like. Internal review. Temporary restriction. Documentation request. He had believed complexity insulated him. He had believed silence meant ignorance. He had believed he was controlling the narrative. In reality, I had been calculating the moment his structure intersected with oversight. As he paced outside the restaurant, phone pressed to his ear, the wind lifting his jacket, I felt something unexpected. Not revenge. Not triumph. Relief. Because once systems activate, outcomes become procedural. And procedure doesn't care about ego. When he returned to the table, pale and shaken, and asked, "What did you do?" I already knew something he didn't. 3 months of silence had not been weakness. It had been preparation. And preparation doesn't panic. It waits. Ryan lifted his wine glass like he was about to deliver a keynote. Not dismantle a marriage. To new beginnings, he said, his smile smooth and rehearsed. The restaurant was dim, elegant, suspended above the Seattle skyline like a private stage. Candlelight flickered between us. Soft jazz drifted through the air. Everything about the setting suggested celebration. He leaned forward slightly. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he began. About efficiency. About positioning. About what's best for both of us long-term. Positioning. I let him talk. I've structured things carefully, he continued. Minimized risk. Separated exposure. You won't have to worry about the details. There it was again. The assumption, you've always been great at strategy, he added gently. But finance requires a certain practicality. My phone remained silent on the table. His buzzed. He ignored it. I've made sure everything is arranged, he said. This transition will be smoother than you expect. Transition. He was about to say divorce. His phone buzzed again. And again. He frowned, finally glancing down. Card authorization failed. He blinked. Another notification appeared. Primary checking account temporarily restricted pending review. The smile slipped. He straightened in his chair, clearing his throat. Probably a system error. He waved at the waiter. We're ready for the main course. The waiter nodded and stepped away. Ryan tapped into his banking app, his thumb moving faster now. The loading circle spun before the same message reappeared. Temporary restriction due to unusual activity. His jaw tightened. Rebecca's name lit up his screen. He flipped the phone face down. It buzzed again immediately. "You should take that," I said quietly. "It's nothing," he snapped. Too quickly. The waiter returned with a small payment terminal for a pre-authorized wine charge. Ryan handed over his card with forced composure. We both watched the machine process. Declined. He blinked once, then forced a laugh. "Try it again." The waiter did. Declined. A flush crept up Ryan's neck. He pulled another card from his wallet. "Use this one." The machine processed. Declined. Around us, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. No one else knew that the carefully constructed exit strategy at table 14 was unraveling. Ryan's phone buzzed relentlessly now. Brokerage account access suspended. Withdrawal request paused. Compliance review initiated. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking his chair back. "Excuse me." He walked toward the balcony, answering the call mid-step, through the glass. I watched him pace. His voice was low but urgent. His free hand gripped his hair. I didn't need to hear Rebecca's words to understand them. Her account was likely linked. If compliance flagged one routing pattern, connected accounts followed. He turned sharply, facing away from the restaurant lights. Another call came through. This one shorter. His expression shifted again. Not confusion. Realization. He ended the call and stood still for a moment, shoulders rigid. When he came back inside, he looked older. "What did you do?" he asked under his breath as he sat down. "Not angry. Afraid." "I didn't do anything illegal," I replied calmly. I made sure irregular transfers were reviewed. His eyes locked onto mine. "You reported me." I documented what was already happening. The waiter hovered discreetly a few steps away. Ryan lowered his voice. "You have no idea what you've triggered." "I know exactly what I triggered," I said. His phone buzzed again. Email notification from his company's compliance department. Subject: Conflict of Interest Disclosure Review. He stared at the screen as if it had betrayed him. "They can't do this," he muttered. "They're required to," I said softly. He looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. "You've blown this out of proportion," he whispered. This was positioning, smart structuring. It was undisclosed diversion. I corrected. The waiter returned, gently asking if we had another form of payment. Ryan hesitated. I reached into my purse and handed over my card. The machine processed. Approved. The sound was quiet, almost insignificant. But it changed everything. Ryan watched as the waiter walked away. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes, I did." He rubbed his temples, breathing unevenly. "You could have talked to me. You could have told me." Rebecca's name flashed again. This time, he didn't silence it fast enough for me to miss the preview message. "My account is frozen." "What's happening?" He swallowed hard. The dinner he had planned to announce my future had become an audit of his own. He had imagined himself in control of the narrative, confident, composed, strategic. Instead, he was reacting. Every buzz of his phone tightened his expression further. "I can fix this," he said suddenly, more to himself than to me. "It's temporary." "Yes," I agreed. "It's temporary." Temporary restriction. Temporary review. Temporary loss of access. But permanent record? He looked across the table at me again. For years, he had positioned himself as the financial architect of our life. Tonight, the architecture was under inspection. "I didn't think you would go this far," he said quietly. "I didn't think you would either." The skyline shimmered beyond the glass, indifferent and steady. Ryan stared down at his screen as another notification arrived. Internal review scheduled. He had planned to leave this dinner having secured everything beyond my reach. Instead, he left knowing the system had begun looking closer. And systems, once activated, don't ignore patterns. They follow them. We drove home in silence. Ryan gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles pale against the leather. The city lights reflected across the windshield, flickering like warning signals. His phone kept lighting up in the cup holder between us. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak. By the time we pulled into the driveway, he was already dialing again. "I need to speak to someone in compliance," he said as he stepped out of the car. "No, this isn't a standard hold." His voice followed him into the house. I closed the front door quietly behind us. He disappeared into his office and shut the door harder than necessary. I could hear him pacing inside. Keyboard keys clicking aggressively, drawers opening and closing. "Log in." Error. "Restricted access." "Retry." Error. I stood in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, listening to the unraveling of a narrative he had carefully constructed for months. A few minutes later, he emerged, pale. "They're saying there's an internal review," he said. "Linked transactions flagged. That doesn't make sense." "It makes sense if patterns exist," I replied. He stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "You think this is funny?" "No." My phone vibrated lightly on the counter. A brief message from my attorney. "Preliminary financial restraint confirmed. Institutions responding as expected." I didn't open it in front of him. Ryan's phone buzzed again. "Rebecca." He answered this time, stepping into the hallway. "What do you mean yours is frozen?" he demanded. "That's not possible." His voice rose, then lowered sharply. "I heard fragments. They can't connect it. It's temporary. Don't panic." I leaned against the counter, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle over me. Temporary. That word mattered. When he came back into the kitchen, his expression had changed. "They froze her account too," he said quietly. "This is spreading." It wasn't spreading. It was following connections. The next morning, his email inbox filled faster than usual. Notification from brokerage compliance. Request for source of funds clarification. Formal inquiry from his company's internal ethics department. Subject line: Conflict of interest review. He stared at the screen as if it were a betrayal. "They think I didn't disclose something," he muttered. "Did you?" I asked evenly. He didn't answer. By mid-morning, he received a calendar invitation. Mandatory meeting. Compliance and legal representation present. His promotion, one he had been quietly anticipating, was no longer mentioned. His startup pitch deck sat open on the dining table, the capitalization slide glowing on the screen like a relic from another timeline. He closed the laptop abruptly. "This didn't have to go public," he said, turning toward me. "It isn't public," I replied. "It's procedural." He ran a hand through his hair, something he only did when he felt cornered. "You've escalated this." I documented it. The house felt different now. Not louder, not chaotic, just exposed. Rebecca called again that afternoon. He stepped outside to answer. "I told you not to worry," he insisted. "They'll sort it out." There was a long pause. Then his shoulders slumped slightly. She was afraid. Not of me. Of Record. By evening, he received confirmation that certain accounts would remain restricted pending formal clarification. Temporary financial restraint. Full documentation required. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at his phone for a long time. "I could lose everything," he said finally. "No," I said softly. "You could lose control. There's a difference." He looked up at me sharply. "You think this is about ego?" "I think this is about disclosure." He laughed once. Humorless. "You've destroyed my leverage. You tried to move the board without telling me." The next day, an official notice arrived in the mail. Financial review hearing scheduled. Date set within 2 weeks. Ryan opened the envelope with trembling hands. "This is insane," he whispered. It wasn't. It was structured. His company placed him on temporary administrative leave, pending review of outside financial interests. The startup investors he had been courting requested clarification before proceeding further. Rebecca texted him that her school had placed her on administrative review due to external financial concerns. She stopped calling as frequently after that. Pressure reveals alignment. And under pressure, alliances shift. Ryan stood in the living room that night, staring at the framed photos on the wall. Napa! Holidays. Smiling versions of us that now looked staged. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer immediately. I walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. "I want transparency," I said. He shook his head slowly. "You could have handled this privately. You could have structured it honestly." He sank onto the couch, hands clasped tightly. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain, not confident, not strategic, just exposed. The dinner had frozen his access. The hearing would determine whether his structure could survive scrutiny. And once scrutiny begins, narratives don't matter. Documentation does. The sky was gray the morning of the hearing, the kind of Seattle gray that feels permanent. I arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early with a folder tucked neatly under my arm. My attorney walked beside me, calm and measured, her heels clicking steadily against the stone steps. The building itself was quiet, impersonal, indifferent to personal drama. Ryan arrived separately. His suit was pressed, but not perfectly. His tie sat slightly crooked, as if he had adjusted it too many times. He avoided my eyes at first, then glanced up quickly, searching my face for something, regret. Maybe he didn't find it. Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller than I expected. Neutral walls, a raised bench, rows of wooden seats that creaked softly when people shifted their weight. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about record. The judge reviewed the preliminary filings with clinical detachment. My attorney presented documentation chronologically, bank statements, routing paths, timestamps, LLC formation records, beneficiary confirmations. Each page was placed carefully before the court. Ryan's attorney argued that the transfers were legitimate investment positioning. He described them as strategic capital allocation. He emphasized that no malicious intent had been explicitly stated. Intent doesn't need to be stated. It can be inferred. The judge asked Ryan directly whether the transfers had been disclosed to me at the time they were made. Ryan hesitated. It was brief, less than 2 seconds. But in legal settings, hesitation speaks. "No," he said finally. "Not formally. Not formally." The judge nodded slightly and made a note. My attorney highlighted the structure of the LLC. Newly formed. No independent revenue. Registered agent sharing a surname with the beneficiary. Capital moved in layered increments. "This pattern suggests intentional diversion," she said calmly. "At minimum, it warrants protective review." Ryan's jaw tightened. His attorney attempted to reframe it as entrepreneurial planning. Future growth. Business ambition. Ambition is not immunity. Midway through the hearing, Ryan's phone vibrated softly on the table before him. He silenced it quickly. But I caught the notification banner. Compliance follow-up required. His company wasn't waiting for the court's final ruling. Internal review was already in motion. Rebecca's name surfaced in the documentation when the routing path was outlined. Though she wasn't present, her account linkages were referenced as part of the financial flow. Her absence felt louder than her presence would have. The judge asked whether startup capitalization documents listed marital asset origin disclosure. Ryan's attorney shuffled papers. "They did not," she admitted. The word dissipation entered the discussion formally. It sounded clinical. "Cold." Ryan shifted in his seat. For the first time since this began, he looked smaller, not defeated, exposed. The judge granted an extension of temporary financial restraint pending full forensic accounting. All startup capital sources were to be disclosed. Mandatory mediation was ordered within the month. The gavel didn't slam dramatically. It simply tapped once. Adjourned. Outside the courtroom. The hallway felt narrow. Ryan approached me before our attorneys could separate us. "You could have talked to me," he said quietly. "I tried," I replied. He shook his head. "You went nuclear." "No," I said evenly. "I went procedural." He exhaled sharply. "You've made this public. It's on record." "There's a difference." His phone buzzed again. This time he didn't look at it. I could lose my promotion, he muttered. You positioned that risk yourself. He looked at me then, not with anger, but with something closer to realization. You really did study everything, he said. Yes. For years. He had narrated our financial story as if I were an observer. Now the narrative belonged to documentation. My attorney touched my elbow gently, signaling it was time to leave. As we walked down the courthouse steps, Ryan followed several paces behind. 8 years ago, we had walked into a building together to sign a prenup neither of us believed would matter. Today, we walked out of a building where that document had shifted the balance entirely. The rain had begun again. Light but steady. Ryan stopped halfway down the steps. Is this what you wanted? He asked. I wanted transparency, I said. He didn't argue. For the first time, he didn't frame the moment as strategy or positioning or leverage. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of consequence. As I reached the sidewalk, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not revenge. Clarity. He once believed I didn't understand finance. Now he understood something else. I understood leverage. And once leverage enters the room, assumptions don't survive. The week after the hearing felt quieter on the surface. But everything underneath was shifting. Ryan's company officially placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal ethics review. His access badge stopped working on Monday morning. His company laptop was collected by a courier that afternoon. He stood in the living room holding the empty laptop sleeve as if it weighed more than it should. They're overreacting, he said, though there was no conviction in his voice. They're protecting themselves, I replied. Protection. That was the word he never fully respected until now. By Wednesday, the forensic accountant appointed by the court requested full financial disclosure from both of us. I sent mine within hours. Clean records move quickly. Ryan requested an extension. That detail mattered. His startup investors withdrew formally the same day. Subject line: investment deferred pending legal clarity. Deferred is a polite word for vanished. Rebecca's silence became permanent. Her social media accounts disappeared. The phone number Ryan used to dial so confidently now went straight to voicemail. He pretended not to notice at first. She just needs space, he said one evening while staring at his screen. Space rarely survives scrutiny. A formal mediation session was scheduled for the following week. Neutral office. Structured time blocks. Asset division negotiation. Ryan spent hours at the dining table with spreadsheets open, recalculating scenarios. I watched him try to reconstruct leverage from fragments. You're asking for too much, he said when he finally slid a draft proposal across the table. I didn't look at it immediately. I'm asking for documented restitution, I said. He rubbed his temples. This could have stayed private. You chose concealment. He looked at me carefully. You're not even angry. I said quietly. Months ago, anger had transformed into something steadier. Documentation. The mediation room was colder than I expected. Neutral gray walls. A long polished table. Water glasses aligned with precision. Ryan arrived 10 minutes late. His attorney presented an opening statement focused on preserving future earning capacity. They framed the diverted funds as temporary reallocations. Temporary? Again, my attorney presented timelines, asset movement dates, corporate registration filings, email confirmations. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Ryan avoided eye contact when the LLC structure was described as a shell with no operational revenue. That wasn't the intention, he said defensively. Intent does not erase execution. The mediator replied calmly. Hours passed. We negotiated line by line. Reimbursement of diverted funds. Adjustment of asset division percentage. Retention of the house under defined conditions. Ryan's resistance weakened incrementally. Each time he tried to argue strategic positioning, documentation responded. Near the end of the session, he leaned back in his chair and looked directly at me. You built this? He said quietly. All of it. Yes, I replied. I thought I was ahead of you. You assumed I wasn't watching? Silence settled between us. The final agreement required him to return the full amount transferred through the shell entity. A formal acknowledgement of financial misrepresentation would be included in the settlement addendum. It wasn't humiliation. It was record correction. He signed first. His hand hesitated briefly over the page, then moved. I signed second. When we stepped outside the mediation building, the air felt lighter. Not because everything was resolved, but because the structure was clear. Ryan stood beside me on the sidewalk, holding a copy of the settlement papers. "I never thought you'd go this far," he said. "I never thought you'd move that much without telling me," I replied. He gave a short, tired laugh. "I underestimated you." Yes. There was no satisfaction in saying it, only accuracy. By Friday, the court approved the mediated agreement pending final compliance verification. The temporary financial restraint would lift gradually as funds were returned and disclosures completed. Ryan's company issued a formal statement confirming that his promotion review was postponed indefinitely. Postponed indefinitely. Another polite word. He packed a suitcase that weekend. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Quietly. As he carried it to the door, he paused. "You didn't destroy me," he said. "I didn't need to," I answered. He nodded once. And then he left. The house felt unfamiliar in the silence that followed. I walked into the kitchen and ran my hand across the counter where his phone had buzzed so violently that night at dinner. Everything had started with a smirk. It ended with a signature. I opened my laptop and began drafting the outline for a new consulting branch I had been considering for months. Financial resilience for women navigating asset concealment. Not revenge. Prevention. The system had worked because I knew how to engage it. Most women are taught to avoid confrontation. Few are taught to document. I saved the file. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, the balance had shifted permanently. The first morning I woke up in the house alone. The silence felt different. Not empty. Clean. Ryan had moved into a short-term rental across town. Something neutral and furnished. Somewhere he could recalibrate his narrative. The house no longer carried the tension of hidden conversations or muted phone calls in the hallway. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. The settlement agreement neatly filed beside me. The funds had begun transferring back in structured increments, exactly as outlined in mediation. Compliance confirmations arrived one by one. Order restored. Ryan's internal review at work concluded quietly. He was allowed to return, but not to the role he once expected. No promotion, no leadership track. His title remained unchanged. Stagnation can be louder than termination. I heard this through mutual acquaintances first. Seattle's professional circles overlap more than people realize. Rough situation. One former colleague said to me carefully at a networking event, "Must have been complicated." "It was documented," I replied. They nodded, understanding more than they asked. Rebecca resurfaced briefly in conversation weeks later. She had resigned from her teaching position and moved back to Oregon. No formal charges. No public scandal. Just distance. Distance can feel like mercy. I didn't contact her. I didn't need to. Instead, I focused on building what had quietly formed in my mind for months. The consulting branch became real within 6 weeks. Financial risk assessment for women in long-term partnerships. Asset visibility audits. Prenup review education. Workshops on recognizing early signs of financial manipulation. The first client came through referral. A woman in her early 50s who suspected her husband was restructuring accounts without transparency. She sat across from me in my home office, hands clasped tightly. "I feel crazy," she said. "Maybe I'm overreacting." "You're not," I told her gently. "You're observing. That difference matters." As I walked her through documentation processes, I realized something. My story wasn't unique. It was just structured. More clients followed. Women who had been told they were not good with money. Women who trusted signatures without reading terms. Women who felt shame for asking questions. Each consultation felt less like revenge and more like restoration. Ryan texted occasionally about logistical matters, property adjustments, insurance transfers, short messages, professional tone. One afternoon, he asked if we could meet for coffee. I considered declining. Then I agreed. We met at a small cafe near Lake Union. Neutral territory. He looked thinner, less polished. "I've been thinking," he said after we ordered. "That's new," I replied lightly. He gave a faint smile. "I didn't mean to become that person." "You didn't mean to get caught," I corrected gently. He didn't argue. "I thought I was building security," he said. "For myself, at my expense," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I underestimated your capacity," he said again. "Yes." There was no bitterness in my tone. Just closure. "I'm not angry anymore," he added. "I'm not either," I said. That surprised him. "I don't hate you," I continued. "I just won't trust you." Trust and love are not synonyms. He absorbed that quietly. "I guess this is where we're supposed to forgive and move on," he said. "I've moved on," I replied. Forgiveness is personal. Accountability is structural. We finished our coffee without drama. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "You didn't ruin me," he said. "I insisted on accuracy." I answered. He nodded. And that was enough. Months later, my consulting practice stabilized into something sustainable. Workshops filled quickly. A local women's business group invited me to speak about financial literacy and relational risk. Standing at the front of that room, I saw versions of myself from different decades reflected back at me. Quiet. Observant? Underestimated. I told them what I wish someone had told me years ago. Silence is not weakness. Documentation is power. Understanding finance is not arrogance. It is survival. After the session, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "I thought I was the only one," she whispered. "You're not," I said. Driving home that evening, I passed the restaurant where everything shifted. The memory no longer stung. It clarified. Ryan once believed I didn't understand finance. Now dozens of women knew I did. The power had never been about freezing accounts. It had been about reclaiming narrative. And once narrative shifts, everything else follows. 6 months after that dinner, I received the final confirmation from the court. Case closed. All financial restraints lifted. Settlement executed in full. Documentation archived. There was no dramatic sound. No applause. Just a quiet email notification and a digital signature from the clerk's office. I sat at my desk and stared at the screen for a long moment. It was over. Not the marriage. That had ended the night his phone started buzzing in that restaurant. This was the formal closing of the structure that once held us together. Ryan had adjusted to his new reality. We spoke rarely, only when necessary. He kept his position at work but remained out of leadership conversations. His once certain trajectory now felt cautious. Sometimes I wondered if he replayed that dinner in his mind the way I used to. The smirk, the assumption, the phrase, "You don't understand finance." It's interesting how a single sentence can reveal so much about how someone sees you. Underestimated. Dismissed. Categorized. I packed away the last folder related to our case and placed it in a locked cabinet in my office. Not because I feared needing it again, but because records deserve preservation. My consulting practice had grown beyond what I initially imagined. Women flew in from other states to attend workshops. Some brought sisters. Some brought daughters. I told them the truth. Financial manipulation rarely starts with a large transfer. It starts with language. "You don't need to worry about that. I'll handle it. You wouldn't understand." That's where the shift begins. I no longer spoke about Ryan specifically. I spoke about systems, about patterns, about documentation and awareness. The night everything changed, I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I didn't expose him publicly. I followed process, and process followed back. One evening, after a particularly full workshop, I drove past the house we once shared. I had kept it. Refinanced under my sole name. The lights inside glowed warmly against the evening sky. It no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like reclaimed space. Inside, I poured a glass of wine and stood at the same kitchen counter where his phone had once vibrated relentlessly. I thought about the version of myself sitting in that restaurant months ago. Calm, observant, already prepared. Revenge isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's quiet alignment. Sometimes it's letting the system reveal what you already know. Ryan once asked me if that was what I wanted. The answer is clearer now. I wanted accuracy. I wanted balance. I wanted acknowledgement. And I got all three. Not because I destroyed him, but because I understood leverage. The truth is, freezing his accounts wasn't the climax. The real shift happened long before that, when I stopped trying to prove my value and started documenting it instead. There's a difference between shouting and structuring, between reacting and preparing, between assuming and verifying. If you're watching this and something feels off in your own story, if someone has ever told you that you wouldn't understand money, contracts, investments, or decisions that affect your future, pause. You don't need to become confrontational. You need to become informed. Ask questions. Request documentation. Read what you sign. Trust your observations. The quietest person in the room is often the most prepared. I didn't freeze his world to hurt him. I froze it because he tried to move mine without consent. And once you recognize that, the rest becomes procedural. My story didn't end with revenge. It ended with restoration. And maybe that's the more powerful ending. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or financially sidelined, share your thoughts below. Tell me what line in your life felt like a warning sign. And if you want more stories about hidden power, family drama, and the kind of revenge that doesn't scream but restructures everything, stay here. Subscribe, because sometimes the most important lessons aren't about how to win. They're about how to protect what's already yours. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.